He was bleeding out on a frozen factory floor. Lights blazing, doors locked, no backup coming. A 42-year-old officer, 5 bullets left and boots closing in. Stay down. Finish it. That's how it looked in the end. Hours earlier, a call came in. Urgent, rushed, too clean. One officer answered it, alone. He didn't know it was a trap until the first shot tore through his shoulder and his radio died in sparks. Now the storm outside was screaming louder than his pain. Inside, men were hunting him slowly, confidently. This is how cops disappear, people say, quietly, forgotten. Then the ceiling shattered. Glass fell like stars. A shadow dropped from the dark, and everything changed. Who stepped into that place no one was meant to survive, and why did he walk toward the storm instead of away from it? Before we begin, remember to like, share, and subscribe. And tell me this: where are you watching from, and how does this story make you feel? I truly want to know how far this story can travel across the world. The snowstorm came down like a verdict. Not fast, not loud at first, but steady and absolute, the kind that erased roads, erased sound, erased certainty. Out on the edge of a forgotten county road, an abandoned meatpacking plant stood hunched beneath the weight of ice and years, its rusted doors bowed inward, its windows sealed white, its sign long fallen and buried somewhere beneath drifts no one would ever clear. No lights glowed from inside, no vehicles marked the ground, no footprints led away. It was the kind of place the world had quietly decided to forget. Officer James Miller stepped through the side entrance with measured care, boots whispering against frozen concrete, his breath clouding the inside of his collar with each slow exhale. The air inside the plant felt wrong. Too still, too cold, carrying the faint metallic tang of old blood and machinery long shut down. Every sound traveled too far in the empty space. Every shift of weight echoed back at him as if the building itself were listening. He paused, hand resting near his belt, eyes adjusting to the dim interior as his shoulders squared by instinct rather than thought. The call that brought him here replayed in his mind, not as words, but as a feeling that refused to settle. Urgent, pressed. A voice that rushed the details, warning about armed men, about movement inside the plant, about time running out. It had sounded real enough. Too real. The kind of call that nudged a man forward before caution could fully catch up. James had trusted it because he'd trusted calls like it his entire career, and because the idea of someone needing help out here, alone in the storm, had pulled harder than doubt. He took another step forward, then another, scanning the wide processing floor where conveyor belts lay frozen in place and hanging hooks swayed gently in unseen currents of air. Frost clung to the metal rails like bone. His flashlight beam swept low, catching scraps of snow tracked inside earlier, already turning gray beneath boot marks that were not his. The realization tightened something in his chest, sharp and sudden, and he slowed, listening harder now, letting the storm outside fill the gaps between his thoughts. Then, the doors slammed shut. The sound was violent, final, metal screaming against metal as heavy locks dropped into place. Floodlights burst to life overhead in a blinding wash, bleaching the world white and stripping every shadow bare. James turned instinctively, raising his arm against the glare, his body reacting before his mind could fully process what was happening. The shot came an instant later. The impact tore through his shoulder and spun him sideways, driving him hard into the loading bay wall. Pain flared hot and consuming, stealing the breath from his lungs as his radio shattered against the concrete, sparks flashing briefly before dying. He slid down, boots skidding across ice-slick floor, blood already darkening the snow he'd carried in with him. Somewhere above, the lights hummed, indifferent. James sucked in air through clenched teeth and forced himself to stay upright, pressing his back to the wall as his vision swam. The smell of gunpowder hung heavy now, mixing with the cold. He tried his radio out of reflex, fingers already knowing what they'd find. Dead, silent, gone. From somewhere deeper in the plant came the scrape of boots on concrete, slow, unhurried, confident, not the frantic movement of men afraid of being discovered, but the deliberate pace of those who knew exactly where he was and exactly how this would end. The sound carried closer, then stopped, then resumed, each step landing with quiet assurance, as if time itself had bent to accommodate them. James shifted his weight, biting back a sound as fire lanced through his shoulder. His hand closed around his sidearm, fingers steadying despite the tremor that ran through him. He checked the magazine by feel, counting without looking, grounding himself in something concrete, something controllable. 5 rounds. He exhaled slowly, letting the number settle, letting training take over where fear threatened to rise. 5 chances, 5 moments to stay alive. The storm outside howled louder, wind battering the walls, snow rattling against sealed windows as if trying to break its way inside. It sounded distant now, muted by thick concrete and steel, like the world happening somewhere else to someone else. James pressed his forehead briefly against the cold wall and closed his eyes for half a second, not in prayer, not in surrender, but in acknowledgement. This was how officers disappeared, not in headlines or heroics, but in places like this, between frozen machines and forgotten roads, where stories ended quietly and questions were never answered. He thought of the things he hadn't said yet, the calls he hadn't returned, the routine he'd planned to complain about later, and felt a familiar ache settle beneath the pain. A shape moved at the edge of his vision. He raised his weapon, arm shaking now despite his effort to control it, sighting toward the sound. The footsteps slowed, then stopped altogether, close enough that he could hear the faint rasp of breath, the subtle shift of weight from one foot to another. The silence stretched, thick and deliberate, pressing in on him from all sides. Too close. A mile away, beyond the tree line, the storm felt different. Out here, the wind did not scream. It pressed, it leaned, it wrapped itself around the pines and bent them just enough to remind them who was stronger. Snow drifted sideways through the dark, brushing against bark and branches with a soft, persistent hiss. The forest swallowed sound, breaking it apart until even footsteps felt like secrets. Under that muted sky, Jonas Hale moved forward with steady purpose, his boots finding the ground by memory more than sight. His olive M1965 jacket creaked softly at the shoulders each time he shifted against the wind. The fabric was stiff with age, thick with history, holding the warmth of his body the way it always had. A small U.S. Army patch rested on his chest, frayed at the edges but stitched carefully, the thread darker where hands had repaired it again and again. Snow gathered on the shoulders of the jacket and melted slowly, seeping in, carried by a heat that had once survived far colder nights than this. Beside him walked Shadow. The German shepherd moved without hurry, head low, tail level, his dark coat absorbing the storm instead of fighting it. Thick fur along his back rippled subtly with each step, muscles beneath shifting with quiet strength. His paws broke the surface of the snow and vanished again, leaving prints that filled almost as quickly as they were made. The dog did not look at Jonas. He did not need to. Their pace matched without command, a rhythm formed over years of shared silence. Then Shadow stopped. Not a bark, not a growl, just stillness. His ears rose slowly, catching something beyond the reach of human hearing. His body leaned forward, weight shifting onto his front legs, muscles tightening beneath the dark fur as if a switch had been thrown inside him. The storm brushed past his face, carrying scents Jonas could not read, but Shadow tasted them all, sorting through cold and metal and snow until one thread stood out, sharp and wrong. Jonas halted behind him, one hand lifting slightly, not to restrain but to acknowledge. He followed the line of Shadow's gaze through the trees toward the faint angular shape of the abandoned plant, barely visible against the white. It sat low and heavy beyond the forest, its outline blurred by drifting snow, as if it were trying to disappear back into the ground it had been built upon. For a moment there was nothing but wind and breath. Then Jonas heard it, a sound the storm could not hide. Gunfire. It arrived late, distorted by distance and snow, but unmistakable once it reached him. Not thunder, not ice shifting, short, sharp cracks that carried intention with them. The sound moved through the trees and settled somewhere deep in his chest, familiar enough to tighten his jaw without conscious thought. Jonas stood there longer than he needed to. Snow gathered along the brim of his jacket collar and clung to his beard, melting slowly against skin that had known worse weather in worse places. He felt the ache in his knees, the dull reminder in his lower back that time had passed, whether he wanted it to or not. The forest seemed to wait with him, branches creaking softly as if holding its breath. He had buried friends who never came home. The memory did not arrive as faces or names, but as weight, a press behind the ribs, a sense of cold that had nothing to do with the storm. He had stood in cemeteries with his hands folded and his eyes forward, listening to words meant to close wounds that never really closed. He had watched flags get folded with precision and placed into shaking hands. He had told himself, again and again, that those days were behind him. He had promised himself he was done running toward the noise. Shadow shifted, one step forward, then another. The movement was small, almost hesitant, but it pulled at Jonas harder than the gunfire had. The dog's ears remained fixed, his attention locked forward, his body balanced on the edge between waiting and going. Snow brushed against his muzzle, collecting briefly on the dark fur before falling away. He did not look back at Jonas. He did not ask. Jonas exhaled slowly, breath fogging the air between them. He rested his gloved hand for a moment on Shadow's shoulder, feeling the warmth beneath the coat, the steady pulse of a heart that had learned to listen to the world in ways humans had forgotten. The contact grounded him, pulled him out of memory and back into the present, where the sound of gunfire still echoed faintly through the storm. "Easy," he murmured, the word barely louder than the wind. It was not an order, it was a pause. For a brief moment, the forest returned to its quiet rhythm. Snow fell, branches swayed. Somewhere far off, the wind pressed against the walls of the plant and found no response. Jonas closed his eyes, not in prayer, but in acknowledgement of the choice forming inside him. This was the space between what he had promised himself and what he knew he would do anyway. Some wars never end. They simply change shape. Jonas straightened, rolling his shoulders beneath the weight of the jacket. He adjusted the strap at his wrist and shifted his footing, turning his body slightly toward the tree line that led down to the road. The decision did not feel dramatic. It felt inevitable, like muscle memory waking up after a long sleep, like a breath returning after being held too long. Shadow took another step, more confident this time, snow crunching softly beneath his paws. Jonas followed. The storm thickened as they moved, wind pushing harder now, flakes stinging against exposed skin. The trees began to thin, the ground sloping downward toward open space. Somewhere ahead, the shape of the plant grew clearer through the white, its edges sharp and unnatural against the forest that surrounded it. The gunfire did not repeat, but its absence carried its own weight, heavy and unsettling. Jonas did not quicken his pace. He did not slow it either. Each step was deliberate, placed with care, conserving energy, listening. Shadow ranged slightly ahead now, head low, ears forward, moving with a quiet intensity that pulled Jonas along without effort. Together, they cut through the storm, two figures moving against the wind instead of away from it. Behind them, the forest closed in, erasing their tracks almost as soon as they were made. Ahead, the storm waited. Back inside the plant, time thinned, not slowed, not stopped, thinned, stretched until every second felt fragile, translucent, as if it could tear with the slightest movement. The floodlights above hummed with a brittle intensity, washing the vast room in harsh white that flattened depth and erased shadows. The cold pressed in from every direction, seeping through concrete and steel, settling into bone. Somewhere beyond the glare, the storm continued. But in here, the world had narrowed to breath, pain, and waiting. James's vision tunneled, the edges of the room blurred, leaving only the space directly ahead of him, where light cut across the floor in hard angles. His injured shoulder burned with a dull, pulsing heat that radiated down his arm, making his fingers feel thick, distant, as if they no longer belonged to him. He adjusted his grip on the pistol, forcing his hand to steady, forcing his breathing to slow. The metal felt cold against his palm, reassuring in its weight even as doubt crept in around it. Somewhere ahead, a shape separated from the glare. It moved just enough to be noticed, a darker outline against the bleached floor, resolving slowly into the form of a man stepping forward with deliberate care. Broad shoulders, heavy jacket. The rifle rose in his hands with practiced ease, the barrel aligning smoothly, confidently. There was no rush in the movement, no fear, just certainty. James felt his heartbeat spike, loud in his ears, drowning out everything else. He raised his weapon, sighting through the pain, aware of how little room there was now for error. 5 rounds. 5 chances. The distance between him and the rifle felt impossibly short, compressed by the lights and the silence. Then the ceiling exploded. The sound was violent and sudden, a concussive crash that shattered the air itself. Glass rained down in a cascade of sharp, glittering fragments, catching the light as they fell, spinning like falling stars before smashing against steel and concrete. The man with the rifle flinched, instinctively looking up, his weapon dipping just enough to break the moment. Out of the broken opening dropped a dark form, silent, precise. Shadow hit the top of a frozen container with a solid, controlled impact, claws scraping briefly against ice-slick metal before he launched again without hesitation. The German shepherd moved like a released spring, muscle and intent compressed into motion. His dark coat rippled under the lights, ears flattened back as he closed the distance in a heartbeat. The collision was brutal. Shadow slammed into the man's chest with enough force to knock the breath from him, the rifle clattering across the floor as the body crashed backward. There was no lingering struggle, no drawn-out violence, just impact and displacement, a sudden rearranging of space that sent one figure sprawling and another already moving on. Shadow did not stay. He twisted away before hands could grab him, vanishing between towering steel racks and hanging conveyor lines, his movement swallowed instantly by the scale of the room. A bark erupted from the darkness to the left, sharp and commanding, then another from the right, then one from somewhere impossibly far back. The sound multiplied, echoing and overlapping, filling the cavernous space with directionless urgency. Gunfire erupted in response. Shots cracked and ricocheted off steel, sparks flashing as bullets struck metal rails and machinery. Men shouted into the noise, voices colliding with one another, orders shouted over orders, none of them clear enough to follow. Fear rose quickly, audible now, turning loud and chaotic as the illusion of control shattered. Where is it? Cover that side. Light it up. James pressed himself tighter against the wall, heart hammering as he watched the scene unravel. The air filled with the sharp smell of gunpowder and shattered glass, biting at his lungs with each breath. He risked a glance around the edge of his cover, eyes wide, trying to track the movement he could hear but not see. A shape flashed across the floor and disappeared again. Another bark rang out, closer this time, then farther away, bouncing off the walls and ceiling until it was impossible to tell direction from distance. Shadow was everywhere and nowhere at once. His presence felt more than seen, pulling attention, dragging weapons and eyes away from where they needed to be. James stared in disbelief. Dogs weren't supposed to do that. He had trained with K9 units before, had seen discipline and speed and loyalty up close, but this was something else entirely. This was not a dog reacting. This was a force acting with intention, with awareness of space and sound, using the environment itself as a weapon. The realization sparked something inside James that cut through the pain and fear, a small but vital shift from resignation to something dangerously close to hope. Another emotional beat crept in, quieter but deeper. James realized he was no longer the focus. The men's attention had shifted fully into the shadows, their movements widening, their shots becoming less precise as they chased noise instead of targets. The pressure that had pinned him moments ago loosened just enough to let him breathe. He checked his weapon again, reassessing, recalculating with a clarity that hadn't been there before. The barking stopped. For half a second, the silence was worse than the gunfire. Men froze mid-motion, weapons raised, scanning frantically as if the darkness itself had teeth. One of them took a cautious step backward, boots scraping nervously against the floor. Another swung his rifle in a wide arc, breathing hard, finger tight on the trigger. Then a low growl rolled out of the darkness behind them. It was not loud. It did not rush. It settled into the space like a warning. James felt his pulse spike again, but this time it carried a different edge. He shifted his weight, testing his injured shoulder, ignoring the flare of pain as he adjusted his position. He was not alone anymore. Not really. The thought steadied him, grounding him in the present instead of the fear of what came next. A sudden burst of gunfire shattered the growl, bullets tearing through empty space as Shadow moved again, unseen, unheard, until his barking erupted from a new angle entirely. One man cursed loudly. Another shouted something James couldn't make out. The sound of boots stumbling echoed as formation broke completely. The floodlights overhead flickered, once, twice. The light stuttered, dimming briefly before surging back, casting the room into a strobing chaos of motion and shadow. Shapes jumped and froze, leaping from one position to another as illumination failed to keep up. The effect was disorienting, turning every movement into a series of broken images. James felt the shift immediately. The balance of the room tilted. The men noticed it too, heads snapping upward as the lights faltered again, uncertainty creeping into their movements. One of them glanced toward the far wall, toward the control panels half buried in frost and neglect. Another hesitated, torn between watching the darkness and watching the failing lights. Shadow barked once more, close enough now that James felt it in his chest. The lights flickered again, and this time they did not come back steady. The lights died, not all at once, not dramatically, but with a tired flicker, a final shudder of resistance before surrender. The hum overhead collapsed into silence, and darkness poured into the plant, as if it had been waiting just beyond the walls. The wide processing floor vanished, replaced by shifting outlines and the faint, uncertain glow of snowlight seeping through broken windows. Long, pale shapes stretched across the concrete, thin and fragile, trembling with every gust outside. For most men, this kind of darkness would have been disorienting. For Jonas Hale, it felt familiar. His eyes adjusted without effort, pupils widening as memory took over where light had failed. His breathing slowed, settling into a rhythm he had not consciously used in years but had never truly forgotten. Each step became deliberate, economical, placed with care so the snowmelt on the floor would not betray him. The cold air pressed against his lungs, sharp and clean, carrying echoes that told him more than sight ever could. Somewhere to his right, a man shifted. Jonas felt it rather than heard it, the subtle redistribution of weight, the nervous scrape of a boot against steel. He moved before thought could interfere, a coil of rope unspooling silently from his hand. The loop flew low and fast, catching an ankle. Jonas pulled once, hard, and the body came down with a heavy, breathless impact that knocked the air from lungs unprepared for the fall. The sound carried. Jonas was already gone. He crossed behind a row of hanging rails, his silhouette dissolving into shadow as he reached down and struck a metal barrel with a length of pipe. The clang exploded through the space, sharp and hollow, echoing far from where he now stood. The noise drew attention immediately, boots pivoting, weapons swinging toward the wrong place. Fear crept in quietly at first, a breath held too long, a finger tightening on a trigger. Jonas felt it spread, sensed it in the way movements grew wider, less controlled. He stayed still, letting the confusion build, letting the dark do its work. Snowlight brushed the edge of his jacket, catching briefly on the faded army patch before sliding away again. He did not step into it. A voice cut through the chaos. "Hold your line! Cover left!" The words were short, precise, spoken with a calm authority that carried weight even without a uniform behind it. They sounded practiced, official, the kind of command men were conditioned to obey without questioning. Panic followed faster than the cold. Boots broke into motion, footsteps overlapping and colliding as men repositioned too quickly, colliding with one another in the darkness. A door slammed open somewhere near the loading bays, its hinges screaming in protest. Another followed. Outside, engines roared to life, their sound muffled by snow but unmistakably retreating. Jonas did not pursue. He remained still, listening as the noise thinned, stretched, and finally disappeared into the storm. The plant settled into an uneasy quiet, broken only by the distant wind and the soft drip of melting ice. He waited a moment longer, counting breaths, ensuring the silence held. Then shadow emerged. The German shepherd padded out of the darkness and stopped beside Jonas, chest rising and falling steadily now, breath fogging the air. His ears were high, eyes bright and alert, scanning the space for movement. Thick dark fur along his back bristled faintly, but there was no blood, no limp, no sign of injury. He looked at Jonas briefly, not for praise, but for confirmation. Jonas nodded once. It was enough. Shadow settled at his side, muscles coiled but calm. The storm outside reflected faintly in his eyes. The presence of the dog shifted something in Jonas's chest, easing a tension he hadn't realized he was still holding. Together, they stood in the half-light, guardians of a space that had moments ago been a killing ground. Jonas turned away from the open doors. He moved deeper into the plant, back toward where the noise had first begun, where pain still lingered in the air like a scent that refused to fade. The snowlight grew thinner here, shadows thickening between machinery and steel supports. His boots moved quietly now, careful not to rush, not to assume. The darkness belonged to him. Each step carried him closer to the source of the earlier gunfire, closer to the shape he had glimpsed at the edge of the fading lights. The smell of gunpowder was stronger here, mixing with iron and cold. Jonas slowed further, senses narrowing, the world compressing again into breath and movement. He spotted the outline first, a body slumped against the wall, head tilted forward at an unnatural angle, one arm hanging loose at the side. Blood marked the concrete beneath, dark against the pale dusting of snow. The man's uniform caught a sliver of light, the shape familiar, even before details emerged. Jonas approached without haste. He crouched beside the motionless figure, one knee touching the frozen floor, gloved hand reaching out carefully, respectfully. Shadow stepped closer as well, lowering his head, breath soft now, as if he understood the weight of the moment. Jonas paused. The world narrowed again, not from fear this time, but from focus. He placed 2 fingers against the man's neck and waited. James lay slumped against the wall, his body folded in on itself as if the cold had finally claimed its due. His skin had lost its color, the pale of it standing out starkly against the dark concrete, and each breath came shallow and uneven, a fragile rhythm that threatened to stop if left alone too long. Blood pooled beneath his shoulder, spreading slowly across the floor before freezing at the edges, as though even time hesitated here. Jonas Hale crouched beside him without haste. He took in the scene in a single glance, the angle of the body, the tremor in the breath, the way James's hand still clung to his weapon as if letting go might mean giving up entirely. Jonas reached into his pocket and drew out a lighter, thumb rolling the wheel with a soft click. The small flame bloomed to life, warm and unsteady, casting a circle of amber light that revealed a face shaped by years rather than moments. A square jaw, gray-blue eyes dulled by fatigue, a beard dusted with frost where his breath had lingered too long. "Stay awake." The words were quiet, measured, placed carefully between breaths as though volume alone might tip the balance the wrong way. Jonas held the flame close enough for James to see, not to blind him, but to give his eyes something to anchor to, something that said he was not alone in this dark. James's eyelids fluttered, struggling, then lifted just enough to show a flicker of awareness. Jonas reached for the zipper of his jacket. The sound it made was small, almost lost in the vast silence of the plant, but it carried weight. For a brief moment, his hands paused there, fingers resting against fabric that had stiffened with age and memory. It was not the cold that made him hesitate. The cold was familiar, manageable. It was the history sewn into the jacket that slowed him, the places it had been, the men it had covered, the nights it had absorbed without complaint. That jacket had crossed oceans. It had been there when medics worked by headlamp and instinct, when blood soaked through faster than bandages could keep up. It had wrapped shoulders that shook from more than cold, and had been folded beneath heads that would never lift again. It carried the weight of men who stopped speaking long before they stopped breathing. Jonas pushed the memory aside. He pulled the jacket free and laid it carefully over the floor, folding it once as if preparing it for something sacred. Then, he tore fabric from his shirt with a sharp, decisive motion, the sound ripping through the quiet like a final commitment. His hands moved with practiced certainty, every motion economical, efficient, learned long ago and never forgotten. He pressed the cloth hard against the wound, fingers firm, unyielding, stopping the bleeding with pressure that brooked no argument. James groaned faintly, the sound catching in his throat, and Jonas leaned closer, his voice dropping lower, steadier. "Stay with me." This was not encouragement. It was instruction. He worked quickly now, tying off the makeshift bandage, adjusting tension by feel alone, his eyes flicking between James's face and the wound, reading signs that others might miss. The flame from the lighter guttered, threatened, then steadied again, its glow reflecting in Jonas's eyes as he finished the last knot. Then he reached for the jacket. Jonas lifted the heavy M1965 and draped it over James's shoulders, pulling it snug around him, pressing warmth back into a body that was beginning to drift. The fabric seemed to hold heat immediately, as if remembering its purpose. Jonas tucked the edges in carefully, sealing James inside a cocoon of canvas and memory, shielding him from shock and the creeping cold. Shadow moved closer. The German shepherd lowered himself beside James without prompting, his large frame settling with deliberate care so as not to jostle the injured man. Thick, dark fur brushed against James's side, and the dog's body radiated steady warmth, a living barrier against the cold. Shadow's breath was calm now, even, his eyes half-lidded but alert, tracking Jonas's movements without distraction. Jonas placed a hand briefly on Shadow's shoulder, a silent acknowledgement. James's eyes fluttered open again. This time, they focused. His gaze drifted down to the patch on the jacket's shoulder, the small American flag catching the firelight just enough to stand out against the olive fabric. He stared at it for a long moment, breath hitching. Then his eyes moved to the dark stain spreading beneath it, the blood unmistakably his. Something passed across his face then, recognition perhaps, or gratitude too deep for words. His eyelids lowered. James slipped under. The silence that followed was heavy, pressing in from all sides, broken only by the soft hiss of the dying flame as Jonas closed the lighter and slipped it back into his pocket. He leaned closer, watching James's chest, counting the rise and fall, refusing to look away. Shadow shifted slightly, pressing closer, his presence unwavering. Outside, the storm began to weaken. The wind eased first, its constant pressure relaxing into something less insistent. Snow still fell, but more gently now, flakes drifting downward instead of being driven sideways. Somewhere beyond the walls, the world was beginning to loosen its grip, inch by inch. Jonas exhaled slowly. He stayed where he was, one hand resting lightly on James's shoulder through the jacket, the other braced against the cold floor. This was the waiting part, the part no training ever made easier. He listened not for footsteps now, but for something else, something fragile and distant. Then he heard it. At first it was so faint he thought it might be the wind shifting again, a trick of the quiet. But it grew clearer with each passing second, cutting through the snow and silence alike. Sirens, distant, muffled, real. They echoed faintly through the storm, a thin thread of sound stretching toward them through the night. Jonas closed his eyes for just a moment, not in relief, not yet. The hospital room smelled of antiseptic and quiet, not the sharp kind of quiet that presses in on the chest, but the soft, held kind, as if the building itself were careful not to disturb what had been saved. Light filtered through the blinds in thin, steady lines, touching the edge of the window and sliding slowly across the pale wall. Somewhere down the hall, a cart rolled past, wheels whispering, then disappeared again. The world here moved gently, deliberately, as if it understood what it meant to wake from the brink. James opened his eyes. For a moment, he did not know where he was, only that his body felt heavier than it should and lighter than it had any right to be. The ceiling above him was unfamiliar, too clean, too bright, and his first breath came shallow before settling into something steadier. Pain was there, present but contained, wrapped and muted instead of sharp. He turned his head slightly and winced, the movement tugging at bandages he had not yet seen. A nurse noticed the shift and came closer, her footsteps measured, her voice low. She told him he had been found stabilized, treated with a precision that surprised even the medics who arrived. She told him his body temperature had been held, his bleeding controlled, his chances improved before anyone with flashing lights reached the scene. She did not linger on the details, only smiled briefly and adjusted the monitor, as if words themselves needed to tread lightly here. Then she added something else. She said a dog had refused to leave his side. James let the word settle. A dog. The memory surfaced slowly, not as images at first, but as sensations. Warmth pressed against his ribs, a steady breath beside his own, the feeling of being anchored when everything else had begun to drift. He swallowed, throat tight, and stared at the light on the wall until it blurred slightly. The nurse stepped away, leaving him with the quiet and the weight of what he had been given. The door opened softly. James sensed it before he saw it, a shift in the room's air, a presence that did not announce itself. He turned his head toward the sound, heart beating a little faster now, and saw Jonas Hale step inside. The old soldier moved slower than before, favoring one leg just enough to be noticeable, his shoulders wrapped not in the familiar olive jacket but in a plain sweater that hung loosely from his frame. Beside him padded Shadow. The German shepherd entered without hesitation, dark fur catching the sunlight in muted highlights, tail moving gently as if mindful of the space. His ears flicked once, then settled, eyes scanning until they found James. At that, the dog's body softened, posture easing, the alertness shifting into something warmer, quieter. He stopped near the bed, close enough for James to feel the faint pull of heat through the sheets. James tried to sit up. The effort was clumsy and brief, his body protesting with a dull ache, but Jonas was there instantly, one hand lifting in a small, calming gesture. James let himself sink back, breath unsteady, eyes never leaving the man who had stepped out of the storm and into this room. "You saved me," James said. The words came out rough, stripped of anything unnecessary. He paused, then added, quieter now. "Your jacket. It's gone." Jonas smiled. It was not wide or proud, not the kind meant to reassure others. It was small and tired, the kind that formed when a burden had been set down, if only for a moment. He stepped closer and rested a hand lightly on the edge of the bed, fingers relaxed, unguarded. "That jacket has seen worse nights than this," he said. It did its job. The sentence landed softly, without ceremony, and Jonas did not elaborate. He did not need to. His hand moved from the bed to James's shoulder, resting there briefly, firmly, a gesture that carried more than words ever could. James felt the weight of it through the blanket, grounding and steady, and something inside him loosened. Outside the window, the snow had stopped. The world beyond the glass looked newly washed, streets and rooftops softened beneath a thin, unbroken white. Sunlight reflected off the surface, bright but not harsh, as if the day itself had decided to begin again without complaint. A plow passed at the far end of the street, slow and methodical, its work already undoing the storm's grip. A quiet understanding passed between the men. James's gaze dropped to the chair beside his bed, where something olive-colored rested, folded carefully, as if it mattered how it was handled. He reached for it with his good hand, fingers brushing the fabric before lifting it onto his lap. The jacket felt heavier than he expected, dense with use and memory, and warmer than it had any reason to be. Still warm somehow. He turned it slightly, eyes catching on the familiar patch stitched at the shoulder, the small American flag worn but intact. There were dark stains on the fabric now, uneven and unmistakable, marking where his blood had soaked in and dried. James stared at them for a long moment, breath slowing, as if he were reading something written there just for him. Shadow stepped closer. The dog lowered his head and rested it briefly against the edge of the bed, eyes lifting to meet James's before flicking back to the jacket. His presence shifted the air again, bringing with it the echo of that night, of darkness and movement and the sound of barking turning fear into confusion. James reached out and let his fingers rest against the thick fur, feeling the steady life beneath it. "Good boy," he murmured. The words were barely there, a breath more than a sound, but Shadow's tail moved once in response, slow and sure. Jonas watched the exchange without comment, his expression unreadable but calm, as if this too was part of the work. There was nothing more to say. Jonas stepped back, hand leaving James's shoulder, and turned toward the door. Shadow followed, pausing just long enough to glance back, eyes meeting James's one last time before moving on. The door closed behind them with the same quiet care it had opened. James remained where he was, the jacket folded in his lap, the room filled again with antiseptic and light. He leaned back against the pillows and let his eyes close briefly, not from exhaustion, but from something closer to peace. Outside, the day continued, indifferent and beautiful, the storm already receding into memory. Some guardians never stay. They arrive when needed, give what they carry, and move on before gratitude can become weight. They leave behind warmth and proof, and the quiet certainty that even in the worst places, someone is still watching the edges. James opened his eyes again. The light was still there. When the storm passes, What remains is rarely the noise. It's the small things that stay with us. A steady hand, a silent companion, a choice made when no one was watching. Stories like this don't shout. They don't ask to be remembered. They simply remind us that loyalty doesn't need recognition, courage doesn't always wear armor, and compassion often moves in the background, unnoticed but essential. Some people spend their lives walking toward danger so others can walk away from it. Some protect without staying. Some give what they carry, then disappear before gratitude can turn into a burden. And maybe that's the quiet beauty of it all. That even in a world that feels heavy, there are still men and women, and dogs, who choose to stand watch in the dark, not for praise, but because it's the right thing to do. If this story left you a little quieter than before, if it reminded you of someone you once knew or a moment you never forgot, then its purpose was fulfilled. Not every hero wears a badge, and not every story makes the headlines. Here at Shadow K9 Unit, we keep their courage alive. Subscribe today so you'll never miss the next untold story of officers and their K9 partners.